she said my name is Colleen Blosser, and my project title is Legitimizing the French Vernacular, a Comparative Analysis of Artes Poeticae. For those of you who aren't very familiar with French literature, I wanted to give you a brief rundown of the period I studied before I get started. The first aspect is the creation of the French vernacular. The period that I studied was the 16th century, and this is roughly the time when the Renaissance arrived in France towards the beginning, and my research period takes place from the 1550s up to the end of the 16th century. At this period of time, scholars in France, among other European nations, were debating about whether or not they should continue using Latin as the literary language in which to write their treatises, or whether to write in their native tongue, French. The second element of my project begs the question, what exactly is an ars poetica? An ars poetica is a literary work explaining the rules of composing poetry. In other terms, it's kind of like a how-to guide to write poems, but it's also a lot more than that, because an ars poetica allows the writer to kind of touch on some of the trends of the current literary community. For instance, what poems are the best example of good poetry, as well as what poets you should emulate. For my project, I chose 4 different artes poeticae to study. The first was from the Roman poet Horace in 1st century AD, as well as 3 French writers in the 16th century. In the middle of the 16th century, a group of French poets who eventually came to be called the Pléiade formed. I was immediately struck by this group of poets because I have done a lot of research in French literature, but as well, I've kind of dabbled in different classical periods, and the Pléiade definitely spoke to me because their French literature and their theoretical works on poetry, in addition to their poems, touches on many classical themes, and they were also at the forefront of this literary debate on whether or not Latin or French should be the literary language. However, when I started researching this period, I discovered that, like many French scholars already know, the Pléiade is something that has been touched on so many different times that in many ways it doesn't seem new, it doesn't seem very exciting, and moreover, the Pléiade themselves were at the end of the period where they were deciding whether or not to use Latin or French. Other writers besides the Pléiade had already decided that French was the literary language of choice. So in looking into the Pléiade, I decided to look for something new and exciting that went beyond kind of the surface topic of this literary debate, and to see what the Pléiade actually did that left a lasting impact on the French language and French literature. My initial hypothesis, as I mentioned, was that the Pléiade had a leading role in making the French vernacular the supreme French literary choice for what they would write not only poetry in, but all literary treatises. I thought that they would be the leading runners in the legitimization of the French vernacular, that is, to make French a legitimate language on par with Latin. However, I discovered in looking at 2 different passages, I'm going to pass those out really quickly, that there's a lot more to this research period than I initially thought. As she's passing out the passages, I'll go ahead and read one of the 2. It's part of the preface of the manifesto of the Pléiade, called Défense et illustration de la langue française. In this manifesto, they decided to not only defend the language, but also to list different rules for how to go about making this the literary language. I translated this first passage as, when this language is slightly improved, enriched, and glorified following the guidelines conveyed by the author, it will have all of the qualities needed to become, like Italian before it, the emulation of the ancient languages. This passage is very similar to one that I translated during my research period from Horace's Ars Poetica, a passage I labeled as the tactful neologism model of poetry, of creating a poetic vernacular. And as you can see, in the second passage I translated, Horace had a very unique way of improving the Latin language and using Greek as its model to create a fresher and newer poetic diction. I also wanted to demonstrate some of the different findings that I had in my research period, some of the key points in how the Pléiades method for improving poetic diction revolutionized both poetry and the French language. The Pléiade had a rival group called the Marotistes, who were similar in all elements except on what ought to constitute the French language itself. The first question they argued on was, where did French language come from? These are three different sources that they sought to both promote and also use to improve the French language. One is the Greek and Latin roots that were influenced during the late medieval Renaissance period by the Renaissance humanists to improve the language itself, as well as long-standing Latin-based words in the French language. In addition, there were several French dialects at this time that had very different origins. They also argued about what the language should be modeled after, and this is where they're really divided into two groups. The Marotistes thought that the medieval French writers should be modeled after, whereas the Pléiade looked to the Greek and Latin writers such as Horace and Pindar on which to base a new and improved French language. The Marotistes also disagreed on the Pléiade about how to fill in the gaps in poetic diction. The language wasn't quite to the point of having the vocabulary necessary to compose in French as opposed to Latin. And the Marotistes believed that they should use the policy of naïveté, which is to use colloquial language in order to create new words based on already existing French dialects. The Pléiade instead thought that you should use Horace's policy of tactful neologism, meaning that they should take words based on Latin as the trusted source in order to make new coinages for the language. And this also implied a huge value judgment on the medieval French language and the dialects. The Pléiade believed that medieval French wasn't sufficient for the language that they wished to create, and that they should use the Latin-based words in order to improve the language. As my project developed, I definitely changed my focus. I moved more to the idea of creating a new literary vernacular instead of legitimizing the one that was already in existence. While the Pléiade definitely had a role in solidifying French's role in the literary community of the time, their primary role in the French language was this different idea of how to create a language worthy of literature. And in many ways, it kind of reflects this image, which is of Pierre Ronsard is the leader of the Pléiade, and this is a painting off of his epic that he created at the request of the French monarch called the Franciade. In many ways, the French monarch wished to use the French language in order to solidify his power, but also for propaganda, in order to show that French was on par with Italian and other languages as a prestigious literary language. And in creating this Franciade, he actually created this origin myth of France that was based on a similar myth in the Aeneid that France was descended from Rome, and that they were worthy of all the literary and cultural legacy that Rome bequeathed to France as a nation. And in creating a French language that was dramatically different from the medieval language based on dialect and based on these medieval writers, they sought a new model in which to build upon the French language. Pierre Ronsard also had this quote that I thought was particularly appropriate to the project. He said, "I did things another way than the ancients, composed words and poetic sentences, and put poetry into such a state that afterwards French was equal to the language of the Romans and the Greeks." In many ways, my project kind of focused on the idea of manipulating a language to suit one's own idea of what the language should be like, and the literary and values of the community that was creating it in which to write poetry. I also want to thank especially the classics department at Creighton for all the support they showed. We kind of have a small French department, so it was definitely hard to work with too many French scholars, but the classics department has always been there for me in both helping me with this idea, helping me through the changes in the project, and I want to especially thank Professor Bakewell, who's no longer on faculty, for mentoring me through very different findings and kind of a hard genre to work with. And thank you all for your time.